of that. A couple of other things before I get that off my chest. I mean, you know, the BNP as well, I have to say this, the argument they're no longer a Nazi party, and this is an argument people, because they've changed their position from being against non-white immigration to opposing immigration in total into this country. But why have they done that? Because the immigrants they're under fire now are white, they're Polish and Eastern European. And being ever fashionable racist, they change their position. But I've said this now, I mean, I forgive you for saying this, but isn't there a track record here? Nazism, Poles, Slavs, Untermenschen, slave labour, death. You know, that's what the Nazis inflicted in Poland. So actually the Nazis regarded these people in racial terms. So the fact Nick Griffin is now targeting the Poles, you know, I would be very frightened indeed in terms of the extension onto this. 3 point. I think it was answered, elements of fascism. You know, Guantanamo is very frightening, and the anti-Islamic war on terror has obviously helped the Nazis as well. But Guantanamo is small number, and it's not a death camp. And that's, the British created concentration camps, but it was the Nazis who extended concentration camps into death camps. There's an important difference in terms of Nazi strategy. I think it is important, as the comrade said, I presume from Germany, to say that both Hitler and Mussolini had a twin-track strategy, elections and street violence. Hitler was much more towards elections than street violence. The Nazi Party was much more about building an electoral machine. Actually, it was more important in many ways than the actual street violence itself. But that was important, but it wasn't the way around. Both could shift from a black or brown shirt into a suit. And both cultivated very different messages for different sections of the population. For instance, they were, well, occasionally so-called anti-capitalist rhetoric, but also they were very keen to portray themselves as free market economists when talking with big business. You know, Hitler was very keen to apply his Darwinian concept of racism into the economy. And we should be aware that, you know, they speak in different ways and adapt from it. There's a form here. And just because at the moment the overwhelming aspect of Nazi strategy in Europe is election, does not mean the other elements of it's gone away. And I'll repeat something else that's been said at Marxism. I think there's clear evidence that as the Nazis are beginning to grow in sense of time, the elements within them who want to return to street violence are pushing hard. And I think they themselves understand that if they get support to caterise that support, to harden it up, they're going to have to return to the streets. Because in a way, it's the only thing they've got to offer their membership. You know, to give that fairly ritualist, disaffected people who are not part of a collective organisation. And that brings me to, I think, the last point, which is how you fight the Nazis. I mentioned the lack of collective action, and actually the Reichsbanner went to its grave without any resistance. It just loyally followed into oblivion. But I think it's important to say that there was another strategy as well, which the communists pursued, which was also a disastrous strategy, which some people on the left still argue for. Now, it doesn't even apply at the moment to the Nazis aren't marching, but in 1931, the Communist Party of Germany issued the slogan, "Hit the Nazis wherever they raise their head." And actually, for a year, they pursued a policy of simply street violence against the Nazis, employing their own paramilitary wing, which had guns from 1923 and could get expertise from Russia against the Nazis. It was a disaster. Because individually, if you just think about it for a moment, in individual terms, left-wing paramilitary group versus right-wing paramilitary group have the sympathy of the police. Who's going to win? Who's got the more money? Who's got the more access to arms? Who's got the cops to help them? It was the Nazis. And it degenerated into, essentially, you know, gunfight, terrorism, and so on. The truth is, when we talk about using any means necessary to stop the Nazis, it's premised on collective organisation. And here I think it's important just to end on, you know, how did the fascists get beaten in the 1930s, 1943? Every time the fascists were beaten, it was through working class collective organisation. Whether it was the French general strike of 1934, which effectively did for indigenous French fascism, whether it was in Barcelona and elsewhere in the summer of 1936 when people took over the factories, went on strike, created popular militias to defeat the Franco uprising, whether it was Cable Street, 100,000 people stopping Mosley in 1936, or indeed the event which fundamentally brought down Mussolini, the mass strikes in March 1943 in Italy, it was collective action that did that. Sometimes that involved street fighting, sometimes it was strikes, whatever it was, or factory occupations, but it's about mass collective organisation. Trotsky made the point. These are the things we have in our arsenal. The Nazis don't have that. They cannot call strikes. We can win the trade unions to call strikes, and we can win workers to call strikes. We can take over the factories. We can bring hundreds of thousands onto the streets in unity. And actually, under those circumstances, we again defeat the Nazis on the streets. Individually, I think it's almost a lunatic strategy to pose it in terms of individual street fighters of the left versus the right. I wouldn't really fancy, I'm looking around this room now, I wouldn't fancy our odds. Right? I mean, in an individual basis, I don't think you lot are very convincing. Collectively, if you think about it for a moment, the 100,000 people who are in Victoria Park at the Carnival would terrify the living daylights of a Nazi, and that collective response is what we have to stress.